Okay, so it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to a New York NY SWG meeting, and a pleasure to introduce Cynthia Pope, professor of geography at Central Connecticut State, and who teaches all levels of human geography courses, including a course on the geography of coffee. She came to this specialty through scholarship and teaching and about Latin America and the Caribbean, and also teaches and conducts research in medical geography. And her countries of focus are Cuba and Belize, both of which I've been lucky enough to visit. I remember back in 1972 when freeze-dried coffee, whoa, big deal, took over as being so much better than plain ordinary instant coffee. And whatever that company was, which I've now forgotten, said if you collected 6 of their little cap things, they would send you a coffee tree. So sure enough, in the mail came this little scraggly, half alive thing that I carefully watered and put into, I had all I had was north facing windows at that time. And no, it wasn't Sanka, it was after, it was, it'll come to me. Well, it grew and grew and grew, and eventually it flowered, and I ended up with 4, count them, 4 ripe coffee beans, or berries anyway. And I at that point looked it up to find out, taster's choice, Linda, that's right, to find out that coffee trees had all kinds of, they were in every state from flower through ripe berries, which is why they needed to be hand-picked properly, and how many berries it took to make a pound of coffee. My 4 berries wasn't going to do it. So I pass it over to you, Cindy, so we can all learn more about coffee. And can you make this full screen for us?
I can, but I should have said what happened with Zoom. And I'm on a university computer. They got rid of Zoom during this session. So a lot of the applications and things that you can do, I just can't do because they don't want us to be using Zoom, which is quite odd. Yeah, I can make that full screen. I can't see you guys.
I'll tell you if you need to. And all of you should be on mute, please. And if you have questions, put them in the chat, and because this is just a regular Zoom, and I will try and follow the chat and ask questions certainly toward the end. Okay?
It's all part of the fun, isn't it?
Yes.
So hopefully you're seeing a full screen with the slide. While you're waiting, have a sip of coffee and find the head in this picture. Don't know if you found him. Yes. And I should say this presentation, thank you so much for inviting me, Susan. I know we've been talking about this for a couple of years.
Right.
So I appreciate that we can get together, even though it's virtually. And what I should say as well, to add to that wonderful introduction, is I like to get out into the community as much as possible as a geographer, and especially as a woman geographer, because people don't know what we do as geographers. And what I found with the geography of coffee is that was one way to really spark people's attention. So it would get them into a talk, whether at the high school level or through retirees or just members of the community. And it got to start a conversation about what geographers do. I teach the geography of Latin America, and I also found that this was one of the topics that people kept coming back to, and that students, even if they were taking it as a general education elective, they really enjoyed it. So thank you for letting me share what I do in the community with you. What I have is I'm planning this for about 45 minutes or so. I realize that everybody's time is precious, and really 45 minutes is more than enough of me talking to you. But what I love about coffee is some of the backstory to it, the history of it. I mean, listen to this description. It's black as the devil, hot as hell, pure as an angel, sweet as love. The recipe for coffee, according to the utterly French statesman Talleyrand. Now, coffee, one of the things I like to discuss is where it's grown, right? As geographers, The central question we always ask is where? Why does something happen where it does? So here we've got the coffee bean growing belt of the world, between Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. But what's also important here when we're talking about coffee is the altitude. You need to be in the mountains, generally speaking, to have the highest quality coffee. And we'll get to that in just a minute. This is also your cacao growing belt as well. So sometimes I found that people will tend to confuse coffee with chocolate and the origin of them. But anyways, this is our bean belt here. Something else too is I teach about Latin America. So I see a few Latin Americanists online. Thank you for joining us. The production in pounds and how it is dominated by Latin America, particularly by Brazil. Now this is 2019. 2020 I would expect to be similar as far as production is concerned. Brazil has the majority of the world's production, about a third, let's say. And then the rest of it is split amongst other countries in the world. You could see Colombia coming in at 11%. But what I think is interesting is people often don't associate Vietnam with coffee production. But indeed, it's very important around the world. Traditionally, their coffee, they are a coffee drinking culture. And traditionally, though, their coffee was considered the robust variety, which I'll go into in a few minutes, generally not considered of great quality, but it would be used in things like, as Susan mentioned, Sanka, let's say, in the freeze-dried coffee. Now, they've made tremendous strides, I'd say, in the last 10 to 20 years with the quality of their coffee, but I think it's always a surprise to people. And the other ones you can see, Indonesia. Think of the Sumatra coffee, Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee, which we'll get into, Honduras, of course. India might be another surprise as well. But India has quite a large coffee production, which I really didn't know about until I started studying this, because we always, well, at least I associate India with tea and the tea culture. But they've got a growing coffee culture. So not just coffee production, but also coffee consumption as well. This I thought was interesting too. The countries that produce the largest amount of coffees are not always the ones that export the largest amounts of coffee. Brazil and Colombia, okay, that makes sense to me. And then you've got Vietnam, but you also have the European countries. And I notice when I give these presentations that sometimes people think, because they associate coffee, let's say with Italy, that Italy is a producer of coffee. No, Italy roasts coffee. They certainly do. Certainly known for espresso, so the ways they prepare coffee. But what they do is they import the green coffee beans. They roast them and then export them. So that's what you're seeing here. So not the largest producers, but those who export the most. And this is where Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and France come into play. Now, one of the things as geographers, as we know, is the where. So we have to know where coffee came from. The birthplace of coffee is Ethiopia. And like a lot of things with coffee, I love the legends behind it. So this might be somewhat true, although it's been passed down so much in literature. I don't know if it's actually true or we just really want it to be true. But an Ethiopian legend states that you had Kaldi the goat herder. Kaldi and you can see down at the very bottom, Kaldi. And he was apparently a young goat herder. And he was in the mountains and he fell asleep. He was a young kid and he fell asleep. And he wakes up and he can't find his goats. He's like, where did they go? So for 2 to 3 days, he's looking for these goats. He's going over the mountains. He's going into the valleys. And finally, he sees the goats. And what are those goats doing? They're doing really strange things he hasn't seen before. He was very worried that they'd be very hungry. But what they were doing was they were dancing. They became Kaldi's dancing goats. And he's like, what on earth? Why would they have so much energy after not having food for these days? Well, he sees a bush or a tree, but it's called a coffee bush with red berries on it. Those red berries, as we now know, are the coffee berries. He hadn't seen this before. He picks these berries, he takes them to the village elders, and they say, well, let's try these. Now, they couldn't have tasted very good because to make coffee, you have to take off that red shell and then the pulp underneath it, and then you dry those beans. But they tried to do what they could, and they knew that at least if they sucked on them or chewed on them like the goats were doing, that would give them a little shot of caffeine. They didn't know it was caffeine at the time, but it would make them a little bit jumpier, shall we say. And so that really began what we now know as the brewing of coffee. When they first tried it, they chewed it. It didn't work so well. They did try to make it into a power bar type consistency that you could put in your pocket and take with you. They did that as well. But after trial and error, they found that they could brew it quite nicely. So they could dry it in the sun, take out those beans, grind the beans, roast the beans in the sun as well, and then boil the beans. Now there's quite a ceremony. It's the Ethiopian coffee ceremony. It's pretty famous, but it all comes back to Kaldi and his dancing goats. So, and that was around 800 AD. Now, hopefully, well, I'm sure at least a few of you are coffee lovers. I unfortunately can only have 2 cups of coffee a day now, apparently, but we're dealing with that. So you've got Arabica and Robusta. Arabica is your highest quality coffee. So even if you've seen commercials for Dunkin' Donuts, they talk about Arabica now. So I think everybody's almost familiar with it, but it's a very fickle bean, I should say. Coffee in general is a pretty fickle crop, and the higher the quality, the more fickle the crop is, and of course the pricier it is as well. This is 10 degrees north, 10 degrees south of the equator. You had to have very specific conditions for this, a certain altitude, a certain soil quality as well, a certain amount of moisture. Those farmers who have been growing Arabica have had quite a time of it the last few years. They've had to deal with some climate change issues. They've had to deal with flooding. They've had to deal with coffee rust as well, which is a type of fungus that can really destroy one's farm. And then Robusta, think of it as a robust crop. You can grow this in the lowlands. So Brazil became the main coffee producer in the world because they could grow a lot of Robusta. It's a higher plant yield, so you can put more of the plants in per hectare than you really can with the Arabica. You also can do monocropping with it, which means just putting coffee instead of really having to intersperse the coffee plant with the banana plants. It is more disease resistant, so it's a more predictable crop than Arabica, and it's less expensive. So Arabica is, we originally associated with Ethiopia, but more and more I'm reading that there's a robust variety as well in Ethiopia that was grown. So it may be that our idea of pure Arabica in Ethiopia may be incorrect, but I would love to hear if anybody in the audience knows more about hybridization of plants and those sorts of things, because I would love to know what the current thought is on perhaps the original coffee from Ethiopia was a mixture of the two, of Arabica and Robusta. I'm just not quite sure. But again, temperatures between 60, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, rainfall of about 6 inches per month. You do have to have a wet season. Fertile, well-drained soil. So think about near volcanoes, mountainous territory. High humidity, plenty of mist and cloud. Think about the cloud forest and the cultivation of coffee. Diffused light, moderate winds. Here's a great example. I love this photo, and it could be in so many of the different coffee producing regions of the world. And if we were in person, and I can't wait to get back to seeing everybody in person, because this is a really fun, interactive session. I usually ask people, where is this? And you get places from all over the world. This is the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. But you could see the cloud cover. This, I believe, is in January. Yeah, January, February at the time. You could see the banana plants. You can also see some coffee plants. It's a little hard to see. Let me see, you can see some of the coffee plants here interspersed with the banana plants. So the notion of polyculture. And Blue Mountain is one of the most expensive coffees in the world. It used to be the most expensive coffee, but it has been replaced, I believe right now, by Kopi Luwak. And I think that's the world's most expensive coffee. And if you've ever seen the movie The Bucket List with Jack Nicholson, they discuss Kopi Luwak. And Kopi Luwak is different altogether. It's from Indonesia, and it's one of the cats basically that eat the bear, traditionally eat the berries in the wild. They digest the berries, it moves through the digestive system. Once it comes out, the other end is considered fermented, and then it's dry processed, and it's milled, it's ground, it's roasted and exported. But it is, as far as I know, still considered the most expensive coffee in the world. But here we have the Blue Mountain coffee, and you can see the cherries in the front too. I don't know how familiar you are with the coffee crop, but those cherries there, they do become red when they're mature, and they're green when they're not yet ready to be picked. And you can see those on the vine in front. Now, Robusta, we think, as far as we know, it was certainly identified in the Congo in Africa. But like I said, there might be some more, some newer information about it being indigenous also to Ethiopia. This requires less rigid conditions. Like I said, a low altitude, less expensive, less care, lower cost of production. And what I think is really important with Robusta is you can use machines to harvest the coffee. So I should say, it says lower equality, it should say lower quality there, generally speaking. And for the longest time, Brazil was fighting against its image of being able to produce a lot of Robusta coffee, or a lot of coffee in general, but that the quality wasn't so good. In the late 90s on, they've really been trying to change that reputation and growing more and more Arabica. But having said that, by being able to grow Robusta and being able to have a high yield coffee, they've been able to control the coffee market. Really since coffee became popular and accessible throughout the world. And an important thing too with Robusta, if you look at that caffeine content, it's got twice the caffeine. Traditionally, if you have an espresso, even though we think about espresso being a really high quality coffee, it had a lot of Robusta in it. So just something to think about when you have your espresso. So one of the things as geographers that we talk about is the where, but why does something move from its place of origin to the rest of the world? Now, coffee is consumed everywhere. One of the largest and growing coffee markets is China, for example, which we associate with tea. I used to live in Japan. And even though there is the history of the tea ceremony there, coffee has become very popular. It's created these cafes, have created this third space that we often talk about, whether it's in Japan or in the United States. So a third space before COVID, obviously, but we'll come back to it. A place that is not the office, it's not the home. It's where you can socialize with people in a fairly informal setting. So with the diffusion of coffee, we talk about it moving from Ethiopia, its point of origin, northeast to Yemen. And then from Yemen to other parts, along with the spread of Islam. So it spread with the religion, and it spread with the merchants as well. But there's some really good stories, and that's what drew me a lot to talking about coffee as well. Like I said, are some of the stories behind it. It got to the point where in 1550 AD, physicians have to control the distribution. At first, the coffee was considered medicinal because, remember, we often think about that as well, right? We want our morning cup of joe. It gives us a little boost. Well, that caffeine was considered a pharmaceutical for a long time in the history of coffee. And so what you start to see is the movement northeast of the coffee from Ethiopia to Yemen. And I wanted to see, let me go back here. If you look at this map, you can also see Mocha as one of the ports of Yemen. So when you hear about Cafe Mocha, for example, and it doesn't have anything to do with chocolate, just to let you know, but it is an actual place in Yemen. We see it move from the northeast and then northwards to Turkey. But it's not as easy as just spreading along with the religion. Turkish law, and I'll talk about that in just a second, it became so popular in Turkey and such a, probably an addiction, right, in Turkey, that we had things such as the royal court in Istanbul or Constantinople at the time had to name a chief coffee maker as a royal position. In Turkish law, permitted a wife to divorce her husband for failing to keep the family ibrik, or the family pot filled. And keep in mind, again, even though Turkey is associated so much with coffee, it was also not grown in Turkey, though. They imported that. In fact, no coffee seeds sprouted outside Africa or parts of Arabia until the 1600s. And what we find interesting are these stories. So by 1615, so 100 years later, you see the coffee bean, the green bean, taken from Constantinople or Istanbul to Italy. So it makes an arrival in Europe. But what also happens is a bit of intrigue here. Baba Budan, which is a wonderful name, is an Indian Sufi monk. And he goes to Mecca because, remember, Mecca is important for Islam. And when you're in that culture, you're also drinking coffee there. That's something that the Christian world did not have at the time. But we have an Indian monk. He goes to Mecca for religious reasons. He smuggles some of the coffee beans from Mecca to India. So you start to see the Indian coffee industry grow. And again, it's something I don't think we really associate with India. But keep the notion of it having to be smuggled out of a region. It was illegal to be exported out of that particular region. However, by 1750, you're seeing coffee and coffee houses found throughout Western Europe. And there's still places in Europe, such as Austria. I often think of that as being associated with coffee, but it really is the association with the cafes. I think in Austria versus the quality of coffee, which we can talk about if there's time. So devout Catholics at this time, remember, it was considered a Muslim drink. It was considered a coffee drink of the infidels. So, well, the Christian world in Western Europe certainly liked to drink it. So what do? You baptize it. So then it became a Christian drink. In fact, it was so popular, Prussia had to ban coffee for a while because it was competing with the taverns, the beer taverns. In places like London, where by the late 1700s, London was drinking more coffee than anywhere else in the world, women were agitating for prohibition of coffee because they said, okay, well, this is great. We don't see as many taverns. Our husbands aren't coming home drunk. But now they're still at the coffee houses and they're drinking and they're not performing their husbandly duties, is what the petition stated. Now, we've made it to Western Europe. And how do we make it to Latin America? Because I think coffee is so associated with Latin America. I do research in the Caribbean, primarily within Latin America, although I've lived in South America. And you really can't study the region or do field work or live in the region without some backdrop of coffee. So these are certainly the Latin American countries, and many of the Caribbean countries are certainly the coffee producing countries. But a lot of people also think that coffee is endemic to the region or indigenous to the region. And I think people make that mistake because they often think of it, confuse it with the cacao or chocolate, which I mentioned earlier, and that is endemic to the region. So getting to Latin America, this happened 1714 to 1720 or so. So we think what happened is it first came to the Caribbean and then makes its way to Latin America. So I want you to think about this. This is a dark garden. It's the Royal Garden of France. It's Louis XIV's Royal Garden, his botanical garden, which of course is not open to the public. Now he's able to acquire a coffee tree from the Dutch, which we'll get into in just a minute. Now there's a French officer who lives in Martinique, and he realizes that you can't really grow coffee in Western Europe. It doesn't have, or in Europe at all, it doesn't have the right climate. It has to be grown in places like the Caribbean. And lo and behold, he lives in the Caribbean. Well, he at first asked, he said, well, listen, and I'm sure he didn't go just to the king, but he asked somebody, And he says, can I take this plant over to Martinique? Can we start some coffee farms in Martinique? I think would be perfect. And of course, the royals say, no, you can't do that at all. That's to stay in Paris. So what does he do? He's smart. He's thinking, how can he profit off of this? He's got a really good idea. So what he does is he dresses up, and apparently in black clothes, as the story goes, much like a ninja would dress up. He makes sure that it's a windy night so that the torches aren't lit, so that nobody can see him. And what he does is he crawls over the wall. He looks around for any guards. He scuttles back down the wall. He knows exactly where that coffee plant is. He takes a branch of it and he takes the clipping to Martinique. But of course, it's not that easy, because remember, during the time, you have to go by ship across the Atlantic. Well, so the story goes that there were basically jealous passengers on board who would try to sneak into his cabin at night. Being unable to get this coffee plant away from me, she tore off a branch, and I don't know where that branch went. There were pirates that were trying to board the ship. They went through storms. This ship then lands and there's drought. There's not enough food on board. He has to hire armed guards while he's on board, because this one passenger was able to get a little bit of a branch from him, and he couldn't have that happen again. So he finally makes it to Martinique. He plants this coffee bush, and eventually one bush or one tree grows to 18 million in the region within 50 years. So this is one route that we see coffee make its way across the Atlantic. This is quite a good map as well. I don't want to spend too much time on this now, but I can certainly send, this presentation is being recorded, so you could see this map. I think it's pretty good. Let's see. With the Dutch diffusion, I'm going to go back to, actually, let me talk about that now because I'm looking at the time. And I wanted to end this, like I said, about 45 minutes. One of my favorite ways, though, is if we're talking about Brazil, and we talk about it becoming the major coffee producer and exporter in the world. So we have to know how it got to Brazil. Well, at the time, we're talking about the early 1700s. You see the colonial empires you see Portugal, you see Spain, you see the English, you see the Dutch. And they're all trying to create a foothold in the region to control global commerce. So Brazil, how it gets to northern Brazil, I love this story, and I do hope it's true because it's a good story. At the time, you have the Brazilian governor, and he is married. Well, she apparently, he's married, and he invites groups from Martinique and other French-owned colonies to the area. So they have a summit in Brazil. And at this summit, the Brazilian governor's wife meets a French officer, an officer from Martinique. Well, they carry on, shall we say, and it's then time for the soldier, the government official, to leave and go back to the Caribbean islands. Well, what he does is, as he leaves, he gives her a bouquet of flowers. And again, this is the Brazilian governor's wife. Gives the wife a bouquet of flowers. And within the flowers, within this bouquet, what do you think there is? There's branches for the coffee plants. So legend has it, that's one of the ways that coffee made its way to Brazil, is through this very illicit relationship. Now, the Dutch diffusion as well, you have to remember the Dutch were involved with this, and I always find this is a little bit of a surprise as well. Because you'll see on that map, if you do want to go back and look at it, feel free to, that eventually to southern Brazil, coffee makes its way a very different way. And it goes from Goa, India, into southern Brazil, which is where the link with the Dutch comes in as well here. So by the 18th century, the Dutch actually, and again, I think it's interesting. I don't think we often think about their role in this. The Netherlands becomes a European coffee capital. In 1660, it's because the Dutch imported a coffee plant. The administrator of the Dutch East India Company stole plants from Mocha. So this, this seems to be quite the theme at the time. They founded the first European-run coffee plantation in Indonesia, in Java, Indonesia. So also that term, Java, comes from a location as well, as does mocha. The Dutch became innovators in coffee production, but also obliged farmers to pay Dutch treasury with crops and with labor. So a way you could also think about coffee is thinking about it really as a product of empire as well. Okay. Now the Dutch, I just wanted to show a couple of these pictures just to wake you up a little bit. I know it's very early on the West Coast. So again, if you go to the coffee houses of Europe, they may be the main roasters and the main consumers. They're not the producers of the coffee. But certainly that coffee culture or the cafe culture is very important to the development, I would say, historical development of Western Europe. This is an Austrian coffee house. I took a picture of this. Excuse me, I took a picture of this because I thought you would really like this. Last time I was there, this is in Vienna, and it's one of the older coffee houses. And in it, there's signs all around, basically saying, if you choose to talk on your cell phone, we're taking your cell phone, and it is now ours. And I just like that. You look around the tables and people are reading newspapers. They're not looking at their cell phones. Also, Europe has become not a consumer, obviously, of coffee, but also they've been very creative in the ways that they've brought coffee to the world as well. So every year there are competitions. Latte art is one of the more famous competitions. On the right, I think you'll know what that is. That's a leaf, and you'll see that. That's fairly common. The left I thought was interesting because we were at a cafe where one of the baristas had just won the latte art competition, the global latte art competition. And I don't know if you can tell what that is, but it is supposed to be a swan. Now I want to go just a little bit into some of the harvesting and processing techniques, because I have noticed in the community that a lot of people have questions on that. Now, some places have the mechanized labor, and if you've got the Robusta farms where you still have the monocropping in place, you can use mechanized forces. However, in the places that grow Arabica and what's considered the highest quality coffee, you really do have to hand pick that. And here are just some pictures of that. I would say the labor force does also differ from country to country. In Guatemala, for example, I think you'll still find families that go from hacienda to hacienda, and they work as family units. There's been some changes to laws in Central America, though, that say children under a certain age cannot work, that they must go to school. So it's had an interesting impact with some of the people I've spoken with, because they say, well, in theory, we very much agree with that. We think it would be great if the kids go to school, but we also need to be able to feed the family. How do you feed the family without having some sort of money? And we've traditionally picked coffee. So how do you really wean yourself away from that? Unless the farm where you're harvesting, that the people who own the farm are willing to give you more money per bushel. And this is how people get paid, is per bushel, which is similar to other agricultural products throughout the world, I would say. So it really is an interesting question to figure out, an interesting problem to figure out. So in some places you have family units, particularly throughout Latin America, working on different haciendas. And then some places it's much more individualized. What I'm finding, though, more and more, if you look in these pictures, you'll often see that the men are represented as doing certain jobs while women are represented as doing other jobs. But what's happening is you're just not seeing the women in the photos. There's a bit of a movement, I would say, in the coffee industry to show more women doing the actual work. It's throughout the world, it appears that 70% of the harvesting, the picking, is actually done by women. But if you look at the popular photos, and even if you look down here on the bottom of the page, you'll see that women's hands are being used to pick out the bad beans or the bad cherries. That's not all they do. They're often very much involved in the planting and in the harvesting. So just something to keep in mind. And now when we talk about the coffee crop, It's how do you get from, you'll often see presentations basically from, from cherry to cup, let's say. This is how you get from the coffee cherry or the coffee bushes to the ground, to the grinds, let's say. So you have the coffee bushes that produce a cherry. You know it's ready to pick when it's a bright red. And people who've done this for a long time are very good at picking even which shade of red is the best. Then we ripen the cherries. They're harvested, either hand-picked or machine harvested. Again, the Arabica is going to be hand-picked. One of the reasons is because when you want to get into the mountains, you can't have machines going along mountainsides. It doesn't work. These harvested cherries, they're processed. You could either do a wet process or a dry process, but they're processed to remove that skin and the flesh or the pulp from the seed. And then once the seeds are dried, these are your beans. So once these seeds are dried to a certain moisture level, and that is measured, you can measure that with machines, it's become green, unroasted coffee beans. And you can buy these. I'm sure there's probably a couple of you on the call right now that roast your own beans. These green coffee beans then are put into these bags. These bags are labeled either according to the co-op, perhaps, that they're a part of, or their point of origin as far as country. But these bags will be labeled, and then they're shipped all over the world, and usually shipped by train, and then shipped by boat, moved by boat. Beans are roasted with temperatures up to 250 degrees Celsius to convert the proteins and natural chemical in the raw beans into aromatic flavors. And there apparently is quite a skill to this roasting. I've roasted a bit, but I don't have anywhere near the knowledge of the professional roasters. And then the roasted beans are finally, they have to be cooled for a while, and then they're packaged and sealed. And most people say that the best way to receive the coffee is having the whole beans and then to grind them at home as you need them. So some people are willing to put in that effort, some people aren't. I wanted to show you this picture as well, because a lot of times people are traveling and they don't realize what they're seeing. These are the coffee flowers on the coffee bush. Here again are the coffee cherries. I can't get enough of these. Here you can see what I'd like to show you, since it's a close-up, is you can see those cherries, the red cherries that are ready to pick, that are ripe. And then you can see that a person has to be knowledgeable and also has to be fast in order to make a living from this. When they pick, you have to leave those green berries behind. And then you have to have the knowledge and the memory to come back to those trees later on. And remember, okay, we had a group of berries here that was not ready to be picked. We can go back there. This is very typical drying of coffee. And this again is the Blue Mountains. If you remember back to one of those first pictures of the Blue Mountains, this is one of the small farms there. And we have to remember that most coffee in the world is grown on very small farms. And the person who really makes the least amount of money when you're looking at the coffee commodity chain is going to be that farmer. The people who tend to make the most are the roasters. So those who can import and roast those beans and then distribute them for sale. They seem to make the most in this commodity chain. But here you can see this is a very small, I don't even want to call it roaster. It's basically a family with a small farm, and half the farm is coffee and the other half is ganja. And I went here on a trip with students, and it was funny because they're like, Dr. Pope, we don't know what to do. They offered us coffee and they offered us ganja, and I'm kind of interested and I don't know what to do here. And I'm not going to tell you what I told them, but other than please buy the coffee. So what they do is they're able to plant, harvest, depulp, dry those beans out, roast the beans, and then sell them really all from their small farm at the side of a highway in the Blue Mountains. So they don't make a ton of money doing this, but it's enough to be somewhat sustainable, enough that their family can make enough to provide shelter, provide clothing, school fees, and food for the family. So it's kind of a side business here. But that's just very typical, I should say, with this. It's very typical of the dry process, where you literally depulp the beans and dry them in the sun. It's the oldest process in the world. That's what they did in Ethiopia, we assume, and it's quite effective, and it's used really in certain places of the world, particularly Latin America, for certain types of coffee and a certain type of flavor that you want to evoke. Here's his farm, and you can see that he's roasting right there. And even though roasting can be very complicated, and it can be considered an art, it can also be very simple, and it's something that you can do in your own oven as well. And here you can just see he's just roasting over a fire. And when you roast, you want to make sure you hear a pop, like popcorn, and that's what he's listening for here. So what he'll do is, I think it's absolutely fascinating. You don't see this in a lot of places. He'll roast something up for you, let it dry, or let it let it cool off. Put it in a plastic bag, measure a pound, and sell it to you for $5 or $6. That's quite a deal when you go to the store and it's $50 a pound, $25 to $50 a pound, depending on the year and depending on the store. Now, I wanted to bring this in just a little bit, if you'll indulge me. Some of you who really do love coffee, you may start to get into the coffee tasting. And this coffee wheel is very similar to the chocolate wheel. And I'll also often give presentations to the community. One I'll do is coffee, and then come back and do one about chocolate. But the tasting wheel is very similar. Now, when you do a coffee tasting, people are professional coffee cuppers, professional coffee tasters, just like a sommelier is for wine. You have them for coffee. And they're absolutely fascinating to watch. And I've taken a couple of seminars, and I have to admit to this group that I can't tell the difference between a lot of the coffees. I wanted to show you one that I'm drinking right now. This is from Dean's Beans Coffees, who I love. They're in Orange, Massachusetts, but it's become, I think, so common to see fair trade coffee and really good coffee around the country that I'm sure you can find a place near you. So this is Congo Umoja, single origin, which means it comes from one place. And that is increasingly important to people who buy coffee. Flavors. If you look at the flavor wheel here, the flavors that they're saying that you come out in this are apricot. So that's going to be one of your fruits here. Lemonade. And then dark chocolate. Isn't that fascinating? I love those. I love those descriptions. They're almost romantic descriptions of this coffee. And so I've had this coffee, several cups of this coffee, and I've prepared it different ways. And no, I don't see the apricot. I don't see the lemonade. I get maybe a dark chocolate, but to me, a lot of coffee just tastes like dark chocolate. But I think it's fascinating how these aromas will really come through in different coffees. And if you're very good at the sipping, or you've got a very trained palate, you can certainly taste these. In certain parts of the world are going to have a more citrus type flavor. I often think about Ethiopia. There's a coffee I tasted once, because some people will ask me, what was your favorite coffee in the world? And I've tasted quite a few of them, and some obviously are better than other, but it's subjective, isn't it? Taste is subjective at the end of the day. But there was this coffee from Ethiopia that I tried, and it was actually during it was in Seattle, and it was during one of the Association of American Geographers, during one of the AAG's field trips that they took at the annual conference. And so we went to different cafes in Seattle. Imagine that. This one, they served this Ethiopian coffee that tasted just like blueberries. And to this day, I can't find it. It's a certain type of Ethiopian coffee, but it's a crop that occurs by accident. A lot of times you can't really reproduce the coffee from year to year or from harvest to harvest, even though that coffee may come from the exact same farm. And that's what I find really interesting as well. But here, if you were to become a coffee cupper, what you would do is you'd have a small cup of coffee. It would be, your cup would be a little bit more cylindrical than round, a little bit more cylindrical. You would smell it just like you do with the wine. You take a small teaspoon, you sip it, like really, not just like, not a dainty sip, like a manly sip, and you swirl it around a little bit. And I believe the sommeliers will often spit it out. I've seen some coffee cuppers do that, but often what they'll do is swallow it as well so that they can also get that aftertaste. And that's how they'll come up with both those aromas, so the scent, and then the taste, how the taste is on the tongue and the taste is as the aftertaste as well. So it's quite interesting. And you can really have the highest quality coffee come from anywhere in the world now at this point. And what I'd like to do is just for the next few minutes is I wanted to talk about women in coffee production, right? After all, this is the SWG. So I had mentioned women often, I think, are still often neglected when we talk about coffee. And even some of the documentaries, most of the documentaries I've seen, I shouldn't say some, I'd say most, tend to really overlook the importance of coffee, both for women's livelihoods in the world and also how important women are for the coffee industry. Women perform 70% of the manual labor. So this is the labor that is very low paid, and this is the labor that's often on family farms. The vast majority of coffee production, whether it's in Latin America or Southeast Asia or Africa, really is on family farms. There are, of course, some larger farms, most definitely, Central America, Brazil, for example. But by and large, most of the coffee, especially the very high quality coffee, is coming from women-owned farms or also women-worked farms. So one of the issues is the work that they're doing is the lowest paid on that commodity chain. There's also land tenure issues. And I know many of you have looked into this in different facets of land ownership. But throughout the world, you're still seeing laws in place that grant priority to a male in a family. And when it is a heterosexual couple, granting the land to the man by default. And sometimes it's just a custom, sometimes it is actually the law. So this is one of the issues that women face. If they're doing most of the work, you're still not having that money come back to them. And then if your husband passes away or leaves, you're there the one tending the family, and you're the one tending the land as well. But it could be that that land never makes it into your name. So land tenure becomes very important in certain parts of the world for women. So if you tackle that issue, you could also tackle many of the economic problems that women are facing in those parts of the world. They're often overlooked in agricultural extension programs. And even with larger corporations, like Starbucks, let's say, they do quite a bit of good. I always want to kind of downplay what they do because they become such a juggernaut, a global juggernaut. But some things they've done have been very useful. They've created a few documentaries about women in the world, such as Women in Rwanda, and how those co-ops have been creative and how Starbucks is working with those co-ops to not just get the coffee from those small farms, but also work with the women to create credit systems so that they can get credit to buy more land, for example. Or one of the issues that I've looked into a little bit because it's something very simple, but it hadn't occurred to me. When you're looking at coffee production as well, in certain parts of the world, in the US, if you want a loan, excuse me for a second, the timer just went off. That's 45 minutes. If you want a loan, you can put up your crop as collateral, or what your crop will be as collateral. Oftentimes in Latin America in particular, you have to put up your land as collateral. So that's really a higher bargain that you have to make if you can even get to the point of getting credit. So you have these issues here, and the FAO stated that just giving women the same access as men to agricultural resources could increase production on women's farms in developing countries by 20 to 30%. This could raise total agricultural production in developing countries by 2.5 to 4%, which in turn could reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%, or in real numbers, 100 to 150 million people. So I want to end on some of the creative solutions, just quickly, that we're seeing throughout the world. And there is, if we go back to this slide, you might want to check out, if you want to buy from woman-owned co-ops throughout the world. Cafecitacoffee.com does that. It's sort of a clearinghouse. It works with 4 or 5 different organizations of women, and sells and distributes coffee throughout the US. So some of the creative solutions are having these women-owned businesses or co-ops. So having women get together, just like this one in Honduras in 1993, Comocop. And they basically got together because they said, this is ridiculous. We're doing all the work and the men are getting the money. Why don't the men just leave and we'll keep working and find some creative way to get some money? And that really is what happened with a small group of women, which has grown to be a larger group. Seeing the same thing in Peru, seeing the same thing in Mexico. And what's interesting is if you buy from them, it's not as if you're really saying, oh, let me just give you some money. You're a woman-owned business. They're producing some of the best coffees in the world. They're working with scientists based usually at Western European or North American universities, and creating some of the best coffees in the world. They rank very highly. Every year there's something called the Cup of Excellence in the world. And it's where these farmers, these small farmers, can send their coffee to be tested, to be sipped, or to be cupped by 20 experts. And from there, those experts rank the coffee. These are some of the best coffees in the world. And I want to end on Rwanda. I know Karen Barton is going to be giving a presentation in the next couple of months about some of her work in Africa, but I think she's going to be traveling to Rwanda. And I find Rwanda fascinating because after the genocide in 1994, one of the really creative solutions to lifting the country out of poverty and creating peace were some of these coffee co-ops, especially those that were organized by women and run by women. And as I said, Starbucks, like I said, I don't like to give them too much credit, but really some of the things they do are interesting. If you go to that website, there's a nice documentary on how the co-ops can really create bridges between people that were at war, and also create a way for people, not just women, but for woman-owned businesses to help develop not just their farms, not just their regions, but also entire countries. So I think what I would like to do is end there. And I don't know what you see now, but now I can see everybody. So I'm going to end there. And I know that this was recorded, but I'm more than happy to send this presentation to anybody if you'd like it. Feel free to pirate it and use it at will.
Okay, if you could stop sharing your screen. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. There we go. Julie asks, are you familiar with bourbon variety of coffee from Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean?
Yes. Yeah, that's one that's become fairly, it's one of the ones that's being used to create hybrids. I know about it throughout Latin America. It's generally considered to be a very high quality. And like I said, it's being used, I guess you could get pure bourbon, but what I've seen it used for is to create a hybrid within Latin America. If anybody else knows any answers too, feel free to chime in.
Siffy asks, is coffee as a cash crop a problem for communities?
In what way are you thinking, Siffy? The predictability perhaps of it as a cash crop?
No, I was just thinking like for having nutritional foods for them to eat in that, like the whole cash crop problem where it's just covering all the land and they're, putting it out for export and not.
I thank you for clarifying. I understand what you're saying. What I have found, and I know there's some Latin Americanists online too, so if again, feel free to add your opinions, is often it's going to work in tandem with the other crops. So you're going to see a lot of polyculture. And so what I've seen is a mix with other crops. So you've got the crops to feed the family, but then you have your cash crop, which is coffee. But it's also very difficult because coffee is, it's somewhat unpredictable. So even though it is a cash crop, it's not a perfect cash crop. And more you're seeing people turn from coffee, unless they can get a good predictable price for it. Turn from coffee to other cash crops. I know in the Andes, you're certainly seeing many going back to growing coca, because you can get more money from that as a cash crop than you certainly can from coffee.
I saw that in Madagascar. The coffee just, it was so depressed. They were getting all their money from vanilla and cloves. So
That's it. And it's very susceptible to the whims of the international market. And I know a lot of coffee growers really complain about that. If there were some way that, again, we could have some sort of predictable income, we'd love to, instead of migrating to cities and our kids moving from the farm, we would love to continue growing coffee.
Okay, Joanna asks, have you encountered any organizations specifically for women working in coffee?
Well, those last slides show some of the co-ops. They're women run and women produced coffee. But I'm glad you asked that, because I'm still seeing just a relative absence of women at the top level, the top echelon of the coffee industry. So when you're looking at the coffee brokers, for example, they're primarily men. You're still seeing, even though it may be a woman's co-op, you might see the regional manager be a man, and he's the one who's going to the international trade shows to represent the women. And not all the time. I think it's changing, but not fast enough to make me happy. So at the upper levels, and the brokers, the traders, the roasters, even the cafe owners, primarily are men. Even the baristas, if you look at them at the global competitions, are men. So there are some examples, and it is growing. It's just the exception to the rule at this point.
Sarah says, according to the web, Peeps, which is Seattle-based, Ethiopian Supernatural limited release has the strongest blueberry notes. So
you know what? Thank you, because that's worth trying. What was that?
I just Googled it and said, Seattle-based strongest blueberry note Ethiopian coffee, and it came up right away in a list of the top 10. But
what's fascinating, and again, I find coffee to be very romantic in lots of ways. It brings us all together, and we all have different tastes. That blueberry, I want to try it, because I've never found anything like that. One cup of coffee from that one harvest, from that one farmer in Ethiopia, that one year. But it would be fascinating. It would be fascinating to find. And different soil profiles create different coffee profiles and different taste profiles. And that's one thing. I'm not a physical geographer, but that is one thing that I would love to get into.
Well, it's just like terroir with
yes, that's exactly what it is.
Anything else, obviously. Yeah.
That's exactly what it is, Susan.
Yeah. So a couple of books that I read years and years ago that had piqued my interest. The Coffee Trader by David Liss is about the Amsterdam in the 17th century and the rise of the coffee culture.
Oh, good.
And Leah Hager's Glass Paper Beans that was just great fun. She was sitting in a cafe on a Sunday morning or something with her newspaper and her mug, a glass mug of coffee, and decided to write a book about nonfiction about the paper, the origin, where did the paper come from, the glass of her mug, and the coffee beans. And so that was just great fun. My last question, and I don't have any others here other than some thank yous. How long can I keep those coffee beans that I have in my freezer?
I love that. And that is the height of controversy. It's too bad it's the very last question. Some people say up to 6 months. That's what I've heard. Frozen in an airtight container in the freezer. Nobody ever does that. We put the bag in the freezer and kind of forget about it. I totally get it. The best thing to do, from what I understand and what I try to do, but really, let's be serious, life happens, is you buy the whole beans. I buy them a certain roast that I like. And then you grind them right before you use them. And you can keep those whole beans in an airtight container in your cupboard as long as it's in the shade. And if you're really super fancy, you can buy the green beans and you can roast them. There's actually several roasters that are quite good, but you could also roast them in your oven. Just don't over roast them because it'll smell like burnt popcorn for months. And yeah, those are the best ways to go about it. But that's what I've always heard as a rule of thumb is up to 6 months in an airtight container in the freezer.
Well,
and
they're older than that.
Wrong.
I brought them back from Cuba and they were absolutely wonderful. So
we didn't see, we didn't even get into Cuba coffee today. It was so short, but we'll talk in person. I can't wait to hear your stories.
Right. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining in. This has been delightful. I wish you good coffee drinking and hope to see you at many more SWG meetings.
Yes, and thank you everybody for joining me and taking some time out of your day. It was great to see everybody. Take care.
Cindy.
No, and thank
Thank you.
you. Take care. I'll try to log off now.
I'm ending this.
Perfect.